These are two swords that my dad acquired from Germany during the Second World War.
If you were in a really big battle and you really showed yourself in that battle, the Navy or the Army would have bought you a very expensive sword.
Imagine walking into a pawn shop with what looks like an old, worn-out sword, the Ashfield Saber, only to discover it could be worth an astonishing $10 million.
Well, I've displayed the sword in my office. I've been told the value is anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000.
Is it a priceless historical treasure, or just a family legend that can't be proven? As Rick Harrison starts asking tough questions, an expert gets called in, tension builds, and one surprising reaction changes everything. With a massive gap between the seller's expectations and Rick's final offer, this story becomes about far more than money. It's a lesson in history, authenticity, and the true value of proof. Let's uncover the mystery behind the Ashfield Saber, the sword that stunned the pawn shop. Picture the shop on an ordinary afternoon. Fluorescent lights, glass cases full of watches and rifles, the low hum of tourists browsing souvenirs they'll never actually buy. Then the door opens, and the energy in the room shifts just slightly, the way it does when someone walks in carrying something heavy, both literally and figuratively. The man carrying the relic isn't flashy. No suit, no entourage, no camera crew trailing him like he's arranged a media event. That's actually part of what makes the moment land the way it does. The biggest claims in that shop rarely come from the people who look like they're trying to impress anyone. He sets a case on the counter, and for a second, nobody moves to open it. There's a kind of theater to that pause, intentional or not. It gives the object weight before anyone's even seen it. When it finally comes out, carefully, like it might crumble if handled wrong, it doesn't look like $10 million. The sword is aged, its blade dulled with time, the hilt worked with detailing that's faded, but still visible if you look closely. It's the kind of object that could just as easily be a forgotten piece of history or an elaborate, decades-old fake. That's the trap these stories always set. The object itself rarely screams value. If anything, the older and more legitimate something is,
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of it, that's for sure.
the less flashy it tends to look. Real history doesn't sparkle. It just sits there, quiet, daring someone to prove it. Rick's first move isn't to reach for it. It's to ask questions. Where did you get this? How long has it been in your family? Do you have any paperwork? This is the part viewers sometimes skip past because it feels like small talk, but it's actually the most important 5 minutes of the entire segment. Every pawn shop deal lives or dies on provenance. Not on what the item looks like, but on what can be proven about where it's been. The seller's answer here matters more than the item itself does at this stage. A story that's too clean, too rehearsed, too perfectly convenient. That's a red flag before a single expert ever gets called. A story full of gaps, uncertainty. I'm not totally sure. My grandfather never really talked about it. Oddly enough, that kind of imperfection often reads as more credible, not less. People lie fluently. They rarely lie messily. So already, before any authentication happens, Rick is running a second conversation in his head that has nothing to do with the object and everything to do with the person standing in front of him. And that's the first clue about why his face does what it does later. He's not just evaluating a relic. He's evaluating a story. There's also a quieter dynamic happening in the background that rarely gets mentioned but shapes everything that follows. Word travels fast in a shop like that. By the time the case is even open, other people behind the counter have already clocked that something unusual is happening. Nobody says it out loud, but there's a shift in body language across the whole room. People finding reasons to drift closer. Conversations at other counters getting quieter. It's not staged. It's just what happens when instinct tells a room that the next few minutes might matter. And underneath all of it,
This one is actually German. It's an imperial eagle with the crown on it.
It looks like a lieutenant's sword.
sits a simple, almost uncomfortable truth about that business. The vast majority of people who claim to be holding something worth millions are wrong. Not lying necessarily, just wrong. Working off inherited stories that grew more impressive with each retelling. So Rick's default posture walking into any conversation like this is skepticism, not excitement. The excitement, if it comes at all, has to be earned one verified detail at a time. Nothing about the opening of this segment is going to be handed to the seller for free. The $10 million story. Every jaw-dropping item that comes through that door needs context, because a number without history is just a guess. So the seller lays it out. The Ashfield Saber, he says, has been passed down through generations of his family, ever since an ancestor served under General Ashfield, a legendary military commander, and reportedly carried it through one of the era's most significant campaigns. He doesn't have the full military record. Nobody in his family ever documented the chain of command properly, which is exactly the kind of gap that makes this story both fragile and, oddly, a little more believable. Here's what makes relics like this genuinely hard to value, and it's worth understanding before we get to the reaction everyone's here for.
I would like to get $6,000, but I would take as low as $3,000.
Rare historical items don't follow normal market logic. A used car has 1,000 comparable sales to check against. A relic tied to a singular moment in history might have 0. There's nothing to compare it to, which means the 7 or 8 or 10-figure number being floated isn't really coming from a market. It's coming from someone's belief in how unique the object is. That's a dangerous gap, and it's exactly the gap Rick has learned to be suspicious of over years in that business. The rarer something claims to be, the harder it is to verify, and the harder it is to verify, the easier it becomes for a very convincing story to substitute for actual proof. This is the tension every big number segment on that show is built on. Not, is this valuable, but how do you even begin to prove something is this valuable when nothing else like it exists to measure it against? The seller, to his credit, doesn't just wave his hands and expect everyone to take his word for it. He's got fragments, a partial paper trail, family history, maybe a photograph or two that hint at where the object has been over the decades. It's not a complete case. It's enough of one to be interesting, which in this world is often more dangerous than having no case at all. A completely empty story gets dismissed in 30 seconds. A partially convincing one is what actually creates drama, because now there's something worth checking. And that's the real reason the $10 million figure doesn't get laughed out of the room immediately. It's not that anyone in that shop believes the number outright. It's that there's just enough smoke to justify calling in someone who can tell them whether there's fire underneath it. It's also worth pointing out something that separates this kind of item from almost everything else that comes through those doors. Most objects in a pawn shop have a ceiling. A guitar, a piece of jewelry, even a rare coin. There's a known universe of buyers, and that universe puts a natural cap on how high the number can realistically go. A relic like this doesn't play by those rules. If it's genuine, the buyer isn't a collector shopping for a nice addition to a display case. It's a museum, an institution, possibly a private buyer with the kind of resources most people never interact with in their lives. That's part of why the number sounds so absurd and yet doesn't get dismissed outright. Genuine historical significance breaks the normal pricing logic entirely, and everyone in that room knows it. That's also exactly why the stakes of getting it wrong are so high on both sides. If Rick underestimates it and lets it walk out the door, he's potentially watched millions of dollars leave through the front entrance over an afternoon of caution.
I certainly appreciate your time. I'll just have to hang on to it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Change your mind. Come on back.
If he overestimates it and it turns out to be a well-made but ultimately worthless reproduction, he's out real money, with no way to recover it. There's no safe answer here, no comfortable middle ground where being cautious costs nothing. Which brings us to the part of the segment where the real tension starts. Because talk and history can only carry this so far. At some point, someone has to actually look at the thing. The expert's verdict. This is where the pace of the whole segment changes. Up until now, it's been conversation, questions, answers, a story being assembled piece by piece. Once the expert walks in, it becomes something closer to a courtroom. Every gesture matters. Every pause before speaking gets read by everyone in the room as a verdict in progress, even when it isn't one yet. The expert doesn't rush. That's almost always true in these moments. And it's not for dramatic effect. Verifying something this old, this specific, and this potentially valuable takes real time and real technical scrutiny. Materials get examined. Craftsmanship gets compared against known examples from the same era.
I could tell right away it's fine carbon steel. The craftsmanship of the blade, the thickness and the sharpness of it is second to none.
Sometimes there's a lupe involved, sometimes lighting equipment, sometimes nothing more than decades of trained instinct doing the work that no tool fully can. And this is where you can watch the seller's confidence start to wobble, even if only slightly. He believes what he's been told his whole life about this object. But belief and verification are two completely different things, and the gap between them is exactly where anxiety lives. He's watching a stranger hold decades of family lore in gloved hands, knowing that stranger is about to say something that can't be unsaid. Rick, meanwhile, has gone quiet in a different way than the seller has. His silence isn't nervous, it's calculating. He's not hoping for a particular outcome the way the seller clearly is. He's simply waiting for information, because until the expert speaks, everything before this point has been narrative, not fact. And Rick has built an entire career on refusing to pay for narrative. Finally, the expert looks up, and here's the detail that matters more than people realize. It's rarely a flat yes or no. It's almost always a nuanced answer. This part appears authentic. This detail is harder to confirm. This feature is consistent with the period, but doesn't fully prove provenance on its own. Real authentication is messy like that. It deals in probabilities, not certainties. And that nuance is exactly what makes the next few seconds so tense. Because now Rick has to translate a complicated, hedged expert opinion into a single business decision: buy or walk away. That's the only choice left on the table. And there's no version of this where the answer is simple. What makes this stretch of the segment so watchable, even years after it originally aired in whatever form it took, is how ordinary it looks on the surface. There's no dramatic music sting, no camera zoom, nothing television usually relies on to signal this is the important part. It's just two people leaning over a table, speaking in the careful, hedged language of professionals who know that overstating something can be just as damaging as understating it. The expert isn't performing for the room. If anything, the more experienced the expert, the less theatrical they tend to be. Confidence in this line of work usually looks like calm, not showmanship. And there's a detail worth noticing here that a lot of viewers miss the first time through. The expert never actually answers the question everyone wants answered, which is simply, is this worth $10 million? That question isn't really answerable in the room.
One sold at auction in 2010 for £7,200, plus a buyer's premium of 20%.
Not with the tools and time available on the spot. What the expert can answer is narrower and more technical. Is this consistent with the era it claims to be from? Are there signs of modern fabrication? Does the craftsmanship hold up under close inspection? Those answers get combined, weighed, and translated into a business decision by Rick, not handed to him ready-made. That translation is its own skill, arguably the harder one, and it's the one we're about to watch play out in real time. Rick's priceless reaction. Here's the part everyone came for, and it's worth slowing all the way down for, because this is genuinely the most interesting few seconds in the entire story. Watch his eyes first. Before he says anything, there's a flicker. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. This is a man who has trained himself for years to keep his face neutral during negotiations. Because in that shop, a visible reaction is basically a tell that costs money. But total neutrality is impossible, especially when the number on the table is this large. So instead of a big, dramatic reaction, what you actually get is something smaller and more revealing. A tightening around the eyes, a longer pause than usual before he speaks. The kind of stillness that says he's genuinely unsure which direction this is about to go. That stillness is the tell. Because when Rick already knows an item is worthless, his reaction is fast. A quick, almost bored dismissal. Sometimes even a little kindness in how he breaks the bad news, because there's no tension left to manage. And when he already knows something is a slam-dunk authentic treasure, that reaction is fast too. Genuine excitement, quicker questions, a shift into negotiation mode almost instantly. The slow reaction, the one where he sits with it for a beat longer than usual, only shows up when even he isn't sure. And that's exactly what happens here. He asks a follow-up question to the expert, not to the seller. A small but telling detail, because it means he's stopped treating this as a conversation and started treating it as due diligence. His tone shifts too, dropping the friendly showman cadence people expect from television and becoming noticeably more clipped, more businesslike. That shift matters. It's the difference between Rick the character people recognize from clips online and Rick the actual dealer whose entire livelihood depends on not getting played. Then comes the sentence that everyone quotes afterward. Some version of, "I want to believe this, but I can't pay you for what I want to believe. I can only pay you for what I can prove."
I think that it would help me out knowing its value and kind of knowing a little more of the history. So even if I don't sell it today,
It's not a rejection, and it's not an acceptance either. It's something more honest than both. An admission that the story is compelling, the item might genuinely be historic, and none of that changes the fact that a shop can't hand over life-changing money based on partial evidence, no matter how good the story sounds. And that's really the whole reaction in a nutshell. Rick's face in that moment isn't shock, and it isn't disappointment. It's the face of a man doing the math between what he wants to be true and what he can actually stand behind, and choosing caution every single time. Because caution is the only reason that business has survived as long as it has. There's one more layer to that reaction worth sitting with, because it's easy to miss on a first watch. Part of what makes his expression so hard to read is that he's genuinely torn, in a way he isn't during most segments. Rick has built a public persona around being unflappable, a guy who's seen it all and can't be fooled. But a moment like this pokes a small hole in that persona, and to his credit, he doesn't try to paper over it. He lets the uncertainty show, at least for those few seconds, instead of performing the confidence people expect from him. That flash of honest hesitation is arguably more compelling than a bigger, more theatrical reaction would have been, precisely because it feels unscripted. You're not watching a television personality deliver a reaction. You're watching a business owner genuinely wrestle with a decision that has real financial consequences either way. It's also worth comparing this to how these moments usually resolve on camera, because the contrast is what makes this one memorable. Most segments end with a clean beat, a big smile, a lowball joke, a handshake. This one lingers instead. The pause before he responds runs a beat or two longer than the format usually allows. And if you've watched enough of these shows, you start to notice when the editing lets a silence breathe instead of cutting around it. That choice, whether it's a production decision or just an honest reflection of how long the moment actually took, is part of why this particular reaction gets singled out and talked about long after most segments are forgotten. The final negotiation. So what actually happens next? In stories like this, the ending is rarely a clean yes or a clean no. It's a negotiation about risk. Rick doesn't offer anywhere close to $10 million, and honestly, he was never going to. What he offers instead is $250,000, a number that reflects what the expert could actually confirm about the Ashfield Saber's age, craftsmanship, and military-era origin. Not the specific commander or campaign the seller believes it's tied to, but can't fully prove. It's a massive gap, and Rick doesn't try to soften it. $250,000 against a claimed $10 million is almost nothing by comparison, and yet it's still a serious, life-changing offer for an item that walked in with more story than paperwork. The seller sits with it for a moment, clearly torn, before taking the deal, not because he's fully convinced it's the right number, but because a guaranteed $250,000 now outweighs the uncertainty of chasing a $10 million buyer who may not exist. That's the choice at the heart of it. He can take a smaller, guaranteed number now, or walk away holding on to the belief that somewhere out there is a buyer who will pay the full, uncompromised value once the paperwork catches up to the story. Both choices are rational. Neither one is obviously right. That tension between guaranteed money now and possible fortune later is really the emotional core of every big-ticket segment this show has ever produced. And this one is no exception. What makes this particular moment worth remembering isn't the dollar figure at all. Numbers like 10 million get thrown around and forgotten within a week. What sticks is the demonstration of how these decisions actually get made. Not through excitement, not through greed, but through a very deliberate, almost boring process of separating story from proof. Rick's reaction wasn't dramatic because the moment called for restraint.
All right, I will be right back. Hang out.
Okay. It is always nice to have an expert look at it.
And restraint, it turns out, is far more interesting to watch than an explosion of excitement would have been. There's a bigger lesson buried in here too, one that goes beyond pawn shops entirely. Value isn't just about what something is. It's about what can be demonstrated, documented, and defended under scrutiny. A relic can be genuinely priceless and still be worth almost nothing on paper if nobody can prove its history. That gap between intrinsic worth and provable worth is where every fascinating story like this one actually lives. It's also worth thinking about what happens after the cameras stop rolling, because that's usually where stories like this actually resolve, quietly, away from any audience. Sometimes the seller goes off, gathers more documentation, gets a second or third expert opinion, and comes back months later with a much stronger case. Sometimes the item disappears from public conversation entirely, either because the story didn't hold up under further scrutiny, or because the owner simply decided the item meant more to them than any number ever could.
I didn't sell my swords today. I think they do look really cool, so I think they'll make some great wall hangers at my house.
Both outcomes are common, and both are far less satisfying than a dramatic reveal, but they're closer to how the real world actually handles uncertainty. Most fortunes hiding in attics don't get resolved in a single afternoon under studio lights. They get resolved slowly, through paperwork, patience, and a series of unglamorous phone calls. That's really the quiet takeaway sitting underneath all the drama of the $10 million number. The reaction everyone remembers wasn't about greed, and it wasn't about disbelief either. It was about the discipline it takes to sit across from something that might be extraordinary, and still ask, calmly, for the proof before the excitement. So the next time you hear a number like $10 million thrown around, remember, it's never really about the cash. It's about the 4 quiet seconds before someone decides whether to believe you. The Ashfield Saber walked in as a legend and walked out as a $250,000 piece of provable history. And that gap is the whole story. Not greed, not disappointment, just the discipline to ask for proof before excitement takes over. That's the real lesson hiding behind every big number this shop has ever seen. If this kind of deep dive is your thing, let me know in the comments which reaction deserves this treatment next. And subscribe, because we're just getting started.